live, I'll introduce you again, and then you can take it away and you'll have the stage. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to TeleShadowing. We are live on YouTube. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box as we go along, and they will be addressed in our Q&A session at the end. I'm honored to introduce our mentor for today, Dr. Callahan. Dr. Callahan is a pediatric pulmonologist in Baltimore, and he is affiliated with multiple hospitals. He received his medical degree from the Rowan University School of Osteopathic Medicine, and he's been in practice for, I think, over 30, 40 years now, and he serves as the Vice President of Population Health at the University of Maryland Medical Center. He is an amazing and inspirational leader and mentor for so many students, and so I'm very honored to request Dr. Callahan to begin today's session on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for having me. What a privilege it is. I think when you get to be my age, you're going to say the same thing. Really, the great honor of being involved in this business is you become part of your patient's story, but you also become part of the stories of so many people that you watch come up behind you carrying the torch. We are in the middle of a 4-part series. This is number 4, and we're going to go through kind of how we got there today. But we're going to talk about the importance of communication. And please notice, this is couched around the idea of clinicians as leaders. The expectation that I have is that whatever role you're in, you're going to find yourself in a leader position. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is the case. So background very quickly, and I'm going to go through this quickly, but I wanted to orient because we've done it before. I have a non-commercial blog site. This is it. On the handout, sometimes you're going to see symbols like that guy. That's Henry V. It's Kenneth Branagh playing Henry V in the early 90s. That is often a link to whatever was there. It's not always consistent, but this blog site also has a reading list on it. I have a more recent version I have to get on here, but COVID sort of set my reading back a little bit. But a lot of the books we'll talk about and so forth are referenced on there. And as I said, the PDF handout, if you see that symbol, it usually means that there's a link attached to it, but not all of them have there. The references are largely the blog site. That's why I put it together, is so that people who are listening to me talk don't have to kind of scribble notes. They can go back and sort of scan the blog site to find out. I've also told you about my biases and assumptions. I was in the military for 30 years, so my take on healthcare is really growing up in a system where everybody had a job, house, education, and access to free healthcare. That is obviously not the world that I now inhabit in population health in West Baltimore, but it gave me a vision of what integrated, longitudinal, equitable care could be, because that's the world that I came from. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through it, not as much as I'd like, and maybe that's a subject for another day. I also have a little bit of a bias because I had the privilege of working with Partners in Health. I've learned a lot from Paul Farmer and his writing and Partners in Health in Sierra Leone. And since being in Baltimore, I've certainly learned a lot about the people in the city of Baltimore. And then finally, where I met your host or hostess was through the Baltimore Convention Center Field Hospital. I had the privilege of working at the state and city level during the COVID pandemic. And we're just wrapping up a lot of that now. That's the Convention Center in Baltimore City. And the salute from the Hilton as one of the evacuation hospitals came in. Here's the assumptions. That's the bias. Here's the assumptions. Leadership experts aren't. That means we're all students on this journey. That means we make mistakes. We apologize for the mistakes. We move on from the mistakes. That's built into the assumptions. You're not going to get this perfectly right. I will tell you this, because it's not part of the talk. There are very few fatal clinician leader mistakes. They exist, but they are rare. It has to do with breaking professional relationships with members, with your patients and their families, perhaps. It involves finances very often. It involves substance use very often. Those I have watched through the course of my career being almost inevitably fatal mistakes, but very few otherwise, which means that you can make a mistake, make an apology, and move on. I was in the hospital this morning, in the front office, talking to several of the receptionists. This is today, apologizing for something I did yesterday. A little last minute, needed some help with something, ended up dumped on them, and I own that. And that's it. That is the kind of mistake we're all going to make. Okay, leadership is life. The investment you make in learning to be a clinician leader makes you better. Makes you better sister, brother, father, mother, aunt, uncle, partner, whatever. You get better because it's the same principles in both. And then finally, people say, well, are leaders born? Are they developed? It's really a little of all of those. And we've talked about that each week. It's a little bit of genetics. It's a little bit of the way that you were raised. And it's to a large degree your willingness to step into the gap when a leader problem presents itself and everybody steps backwards. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It's not a matter of position. You may say, well, I can go to sleep during this talk because I don't have a leadership position. Leadership doesn't require a position, and it no longer really means that you're the boss. That's an old model of leadership, end of the last century, beginning of my own career, where a doctor would walk onto a unit. I was a technician before I got into medical school after I graduated college, that little gap that some of us find ourselves in to be able to grow up. And the legend on the unit was right before I got there was an expectation that when the head doctor came in, the nurses stood up. So it's not that long ago, but that really is moving away, as we'll see in a minute. Why me? Here's why. Because when you speak, people listen. And that's what this thing largely captures. When you speak as the most respected group of individuals in the country, people listen. And almost any poll puts nurses, doctors, pharmacists at the very top in terms of people that are respected and listened to. So why now? We've talked about this multiple times. We have a healthcare system that is largely dysfunctional. It's very good if you can find your way into it. It is not so good if you can't find your way into it. And even then, the outcomes don't match up to some of our peer nations around the world, both in terms of cost and life expectancy. So I'll sometimes say we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, but at least our citizens don't live as long. So it's not as expensive as long. And you can see rated internationally, we fall pretty far down on the list of where we should be. This is what our healthcare system looks like to our patients a lot of times. They want access, they want convenience, they want excellence, they have questions, broad questions. They need insight into their own health. They're asking for intervention, and this is what the healthcare system looks like very often to them. You're good if you know somebody. You're good if you have a doctor that happens to answer their emails and their phone calls, but it's very difficult to access the care. And we talked about this before too, that the world I grew up in was parallel monodisciplinary care. I see the patient, then the ENT doctor sees the patient, then the audiology sees the patient, refers him for a CAT scan. I didn't even know the CAT scan was ordered. That's parallel monodisciplinary care. When those groups begin talking to each other, like in the world of an electronic medical record, which I have watched come in over the course of my own career, you begin to get into polydisciplinary. When that group talks together at the same time, you get multidisciplinary. And when you bring the patient, the parent, the family into the conversation broadly, I think you have all the experts and the family together, you get into true interdisciplinary care, a flattening of the organization, as Atul Gawande pointed out in his 2011 address to the Harvard Medical School graduating class that's titled Cowboys and Pit Crews, and you can find that online. Inspirational, but also revolutionary, really, for its time, now 10 or 15 years ago. We'll come back to this quote, Duce tempus eget, but we already know that Ducimus means lead. That's the Latin base root for lead, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So how do we do this? We've talked about a model all along, and I love George Box. All models are wrong or some are useful. They're wrong usually because they're incomplete. It's not that they're inaccurate. I mean, your model's as good as my model, but develop your own model of what you will look like as a clinician leader. You're the one who on the nursery unit, after you examine that well baby as a third-year medical student, you're the only one that changes the diaper and re-swaddles the baby. I'm telling you, the nurses will notice. After a code is over, the doctors throw down their gloves in disgust and walk away. You, as the medical student and the early resident, you'll stay there with the nurses, perhaps shedding a tear yourselves, while you help prepare the situation for the family to come in. Now, fortunately, it's not that way all the time, but those are the ways you develop your own model of what leadership will look like. This is a model that has been helpful for us. It's published in a textbook around military medicine. It became the backbone of the leadership model that was taught at USU. It's been modified a little bit over the last couple of years, but we focus on character, competence, context, and communication. And we've been through character, competence, and context. I believe you can probably find them online. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about that communication piece. And I like to break it into the idea of the narrative or the story, and then the rhetoric, the speech. Most of what you do today, most of what you'll do this week, most of what you do in general is what you say. The vast majority of the way we communicate our presence in the world is based on what we say. They don't see me do a whole lot in my job. In fact, if my kids ask me, what did you do today? Most of what I was doing was what I said, either electronically, in emails, and text messages, in person, on the phone, in meetings. Most of what we do is what we say, which is why for a leader, communication is so critically important. And we're going to talk a little bit about narrative and rhetoric. And the model I like to think about in the narrative way of thinking is the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we find ourselves in. And every day, on every round, as a medical student and a resident, as attending, you find yourself as you walk into the room in another narrative. The unfortunate thing is that we drag our own narrative into that setting and often supplant what's happening in the room, in the exam room, or in the hospital room, or in the operating room with our own story and our own priorities. And one of the disciplines we learn is where to balance that. We don't want to stop feeling or thinking, but we also don't want to dominate whatever that situation is. And we'll go through both of these to start out with narrative. Some of this we talked about before, and we've talked a little bit about Gunther Gable-Williams, the lion tamer whose son took over the business, and said, Dad, what advice do you have for me as I go into the lion cage? And he said, son, I got one piece of advice for you. When you go into the cage, you need to be there. You need to be present. And so the first fundamental piece of understanding narrative is the need to be present. And I've blogged about this a bunch of times. We could talk about this all day because we're horrible at it. Wait, I won't blame you. I'm horrible at this. I'm constantly in my own head. I'm thinking about what I just read. I'm thinking about what I have to do later in the day. I'm thinking about how much I hate this electronic medical record, what happens to be. So being there, being present, whatever discipline it takes, is one of those ones we have to overcome. I did not grow up in the era of iPhones, but I did run hospitals for the military in that era. And I had to encourage people that in our organization, we do not carry our phones in our hands when we're out in the hallways. That's the time for us to tune into each other. And I would ask you, as you develop your model of clinician leadership, what it will look like for you. And that's really the way we often come across as we move through the hospital. This is how our patients may see us. This is how our peers may see us. And we need to be very careful about the way and the thing that we attend to. And we talked a little bit about that before. And part of it is the myth of multitasking. Part of narrative is being present, and part of being present is being able to listen, which we'll talk about. And multitasking is a fallacy. Less than 5% of people can truly multitask. Most of what we do is serial monotasking. We do a task and then we withdraw from that task and we do another task, and we can do it very quickly, but not really quickly enough to be able to do all of them excellently. It is the way we rely on to get everything done, but we're doing an injustice, as it says. We are sequential, not simultaneous beings. It's been around since the dawn of time. So part of the narrative and listening to the narrative and being present in the story of another person, the story we find ourselves in, is recognizing that multitasking is one of the ways we undermine our ability to remember what happened ourselves, but to be memorable in that setting as well. And I talked a little bit about this, I think the last time, about some of the rules when you're in the office. Turn off the iPhone sound, turn off the jingle, turn aside from your computer when your patient comes in. If you need to watch the clock like I am, I always have a clock where I can see it and no one can see me looking at my wrist, which I constantly do. Don't try and do email and phone while you're talking and walking, and then make sure that you have time in your schedule to think. Think about it. If you have a moment that's quiet, you're just like me and your hand reaches for your phone in your purse or pocket. That's a little bit of a curse because it's taking up any time we might have had for reflective thinking. So make sure that becomes part of your schedule. And I told you the story of my daughter first calling me on her first day, University of Miami, nursing student on her way to her first day of clinicals. And she asked me the question, Dad, what advice can you give me on my first day? The fact that it was in the dark and she was on a bicycle and didn't have a helmet on was actually my first piece of advice to her. But I held back on that because she's heard that enough from her father. The first thing that came to me was remember to look into their eyes. The idea that the way that we enter into the story of another person is by making eye contact. It's one of the most powerful things that I learned almost by accident in an early general pediatric practice where our patients were scheduled 12 an hour, one every 5 minutes. The ability to sit, make eye contact, lean forward, mirror their faces with my face became a key way for me to connect with them. And what people would say to me after having seen on a Saturday 72 patients in 6 hours, they would say back to me, Dr. Callahan really listens. And I have to tell you the truth. I didn't really think that I was that good a listener. I just tried to focus with each person in each of the 6 exam rooms. We would go up and down for 6 straight hours. And again, it wasn't a great practice. It was a one of necessity. I don't necessarily recommend that, but I will tell you that that discipline, sit down, lean forward, look into their eyes and mirror their face with yours, is a discipline that has served me well, both to teach myself to be present, but also to be present for our patients. So the story we tell ourselves, this narrative is shaped by a whole lot of different things. And then it's translated in a lot of ways to whatever that current story is that we find ourselves in. Where does that story that we tell ourselves about ourselves come from? I love the idea of narratives. Our lives are a tapestry of different narratives. We are literally a tapestry of all of the different stories that we've encountered and we have internalized and assimilated ourselves through the course of our training, through our growing up and through college and through medical school and our residency, our professional experience, the first practice we work for, the second practice we inevitably work for because nobody ever stays at the first one. All of those become part of a tapestry of narratives. And this is just one model. Remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful. A micro narrative is the story that we were told about ourselves. When I was a first grader, I opened my little lunch bag as a first grader. I can remember it like it was yesterday. And there would be a little note in there from my mother. And the note from my mother would say, "You are my brave knight. Keep your honor bright today." Now tell me that doesn't begin to communicate some level of micro narrative. And here's, for those of you who will or are parents or will be parents, remember how important those words are early on. Those little notes shaped and began to shape my own micro narrative of who I am. Longer story for another day. I blogged about it, about how that vision got into my soul and began to shape sort of who I was. So that's a little bit of a micro narrative. A meso narrative is the story we tell ourselves about the people we come from. And I come from Irish stock on both sides of my family. My mother's grandfather, my great grandfather, Patrick O'Sullivan, on my mother's side, in the preamble of his will said, "I am proud of 3 things in this life: my Irish heritage, my American citizenship, and my Catholic faith." And those 3 things became part of my own meso narrative as I grew up. Now, everybody's life takes different courses. Mine has as well, but those are still part of the meso narrative, that middle level narrative. And then you get to the macro narrative, right? The macro narrative is these larger stories. And to be completely level politically, I've looked at, these are 2 dominant macro narratives in my own lifetime. President Obama's first run, yes, we can, that idea, yes, we can, became a macro narrative that the country sort of enveloped together, those who are backing that. And then certainly making America great again for the former president was also a macro narrative. It begins to inform all of the other narratives. For somebody coming from the military, the Army strong narrative is another important one. And then below all of the meta means foundation or with, there is a story that ties all our stories together. Ideally, for some of us, that might be faith. For some of it might be a dominant philosophy, whether it's around feminism, whether it's around our gender identity. These become meta narratives that sort of inform all of the other narratives. And recognizing this tapestry helps us when we go into a room with a patient whom we've never met to be able to figure out where those narratives kind of are as we encounter that, and then how to sort of set them aside, not completely, but set them aside enough so that we can hear about our patient's narrative. What influences that is a whole family of different biases. And we may have talked here about implicit bias, and you can Google that and take the implicit bias test online. We all tend towards in-group favoritism. That has to do with that meso narrative. I'm a white, Anglo-Saxon, European American male, the dominant sort of group in the culture that I'm a part of. And I naturally am drawn to other people with like interest and backgrounds. So that is a bias we have to carry with us. Overclaiming credit. I am above average. Most drivers will tell you that they are above average drivers, and that can't possibly be true because that's not how average works. But we overclaim credit, and then we are insidiously, we have this tendency to move towards bias that can benefit us. And that's a picture from a movie that's called The Fugitive, about a pharmaceutical company called Devlin McGregor. And it's the influence of finances. And ladies and gentlemen, I have watched this through my career. Forgive that use of terms, that's old school, but I've watched this through my career as opportunities or accidents where people have somewhat run aground over time. So everybody has a narrative. Everybody has a family of narratives. The narrative, your own narrative colors your ability to understand other people's narratives. And it's important. It affects our biases. Our biases are affected by the narrative and vice versa. It's important to recognize all of this because it goes back into our ability to understand our patients' narratives, our patients' stories. So that story we find ourselves in becomes crucial. Remember, you're meeting a total stranger for the first time when you walk into that exam room, or when you walk in to do the H&P as a medical student on this new patient that's just been admitted, and they are not having their best day. Most people's best days do not involve ambulances or hospitals. And I think about that living in the inner city every time I hear an ambulance. It may be inconvenient to me to be woken up in the middle of the night, but that person is not having a good day. They're having their worst day. So we move into that environment as total strangers, and in some cases, inherently distrusted because of how we look or how we dress or how old we are. I was a much younger looking medical student that people would give me grief about the Doogie Howser thing. All of those things we carry with us when we go into the room, and we've got to figure out how to be able to take a history, take a story, take a narrative so that we can begin to shape what we think is wrong. Interestingly, in pediatrics in particular, and peds pulmonary in specific, which I've done now for 30 years plus, the history really is where most of your information comes from. In fact, I will sometimes tell the residents and the medical students, if you finish your history and you're not pretty dang sure what's wrong, you probably didn't ask the right questions. And whether you're working up a child, an infant for apnea, or whether you're taking a history on a young child with chronic cough, if you don't know by the end of the history what probably is going on here, then you probably need more history. That's why the narrative becomes so important, and our ability to attend to it becomes so important. And this is to say nothing of our leader roles as clinicians, and recognizing that in that healthcare team, there are people who are coming to the job with their own sets of narrative, whether it's the harried nurse who asked me as an intern to rewrite the patient's orders after they had returned from an aborted trip to the operating room. And I just said, I'm not going to do it. I don't have the time. And I was worn out. And she said to me, you used to be such a nice guy. And I was sort of heartbroken at that moment to think that I had given that up. And she was probably right. I was not having a good day. But the point is, I needed to think about where she was as well. That's part of my responsibility as a member of this horizontally oriented healthcare team. As we said, we talked a little bit about on and off stage before. It's fine to go off stage with people and to joke a little bit. We used to joke about what we called in medicine in my day, quote, black humor, the ability to laugh at things that most people would not think was funny. William Osler once said that if I laugh at any human thing, 'tis that I might not weep. So William Osler recognized that sometimes we laugh at things because it's right next to and perhaps preventing us from crying about something, the typical things that we encounter as clinicians, moving through life. As I often say, we get the privilege of being with patients and their families at their absolutely best days. They're cured of cancer. They have a new baby born. The surgery was successful. I know what's wrong with you, and there's a treatment for it. And then we also get to be with them on their absolute worst days. And it's a privilege for us either way. And it's in those moments we are on stage. And we have to be able to put aside some of the things that distract us to pay attention to that. And we beat that dead a little bit. So what about hearing the narrative? And so this gets to this idea of our ability to listen. And I learned this from having a lot of children that are now adults and watching them as they grew up and realizing even last night in a conversation with one of my adult children, as he was telling me something, I interrupted him and he said, Dad, if you had listened to all of what I was saying, you would know the answer to what you were just asking. And he's right. And that was last night. So when I tell you that I don't have this 100%, I think you appreciate where I'm coming from. I talk about parsing this verb to hear. And for most of us, with all the conversation that's going around us, we walk into the room, we're not paying attention to the mother says something about the child says something back. Sometimes mothers will narrate as though it's the baby talking. And you walk in and the baby who's 7 or 8 or 10 months old, and the mother will say, and I've seen this so many times, tell doctor that you don't feel good. Tell doctor that you've been throwing up. Tell doctor that you don't feel well. And after a while, you just sort of tune out and begin kind of hearing what you want. Or even worse, you pick up the chart, you're running behind, it says N and V. N and V circled on the chart or in the electronics, that's the thing. N and V means nausea and vomiting. You walk into the room and you ignore everything that doesn't fit with the diagnosis you walked in the room with. This is another child with viral gastroenteritis. Therefore, I will take a history and I will not listen to the things that don't match that. So this is where ignore. Wait, what did you say? What did you say that the child had surgery at one point? Take his shirt off again and let me see. And you take the shirt off and there you see this massive scar down the middle of the chest, and you find out that the child had esophageal atresia as an infant, was reconnected. And this reason for vomiting is much more serious than just gastroenteritis. True story. So paying attention as we go through. Next, we begin to hear a history, and how long does it take before we interrupt them? Less than 20 seconds. The statistics say that I'm taking a history from you, and about 15 or 18 seconds into it, I'm going to interrupt you for the first time. I don't let you run the whole thing. Who knows what else you might have said that would answer the very question I'm about to ask. In the military, we do this all the time. We say, okay, here, I got it. I did that one time to my spouse. Remember, we talked about how leadership, clinician leadership, and life are very similar. I said that one time to my spouse, and she said, don't ever say that again. Part of you listening to me is that I get to decide how much I have to say in any given setting. So that was just a one time in my marriage mistake. Well, maybe more than one, but not a lot, because we're learning that. That's the way we need to be with our patients as well. Finally, we get to the point where we start nodding, we're leaning forward, we're making eye contact, and we say, okay, I understand. That's not far enough, because we have to get to this idea of attending. And attending really comes from a Latin word that means to reach out, to be able to touch. So I don't only want to just understand, I want to get behind that and understand what they're worried about. Ma'am, I know we've been through this diagnosis before, and now I've seen your child for the second time, which what I'm pretty sure is gastroenteritis, but I get the sense that you're concerned about something else. Would you tell me a little bit about that? And she breaks into tears and says that her mother just passed away from ovarian cancer. And she was worried about seeing the same symptoms in her toddler daughter. And I could reassure her that daughters don't get that. But she's grieving herself about the loss of her mother at a too early age. And that's the piece behind this. And we have to, as clinicians, work through all of these things if we really want to touch and care for our patients. We've talked about this quote before, but I want to quote it again. This is about leadership and an ancient Egyptian 2500 BC. Those who must listen to the pleas and cries of their patients should do so patiently, because the patients want attention for what they say even more than the accomplishing for which they came. It was in hieroglyphics originally. It probably reads a little differently, but the point is that patients want to be heard as much as they want you to do something to help them. And sometimes that's all they want, is somebody to hear. And I can tell you, in dealing with patients that have chronic diseases that are ultimately fatal, this becomes crucially important, our ability to listen attentively to what they say, because that's what they really are coming in for. And you'll see patients like this, and you'll care for them. And you'll say, I just saw her last week. I'm sure the medicine didn't take. There's something else that she came in. Remember, the vast majority of the people that we have the privilege of caring for would almost certainly rather be anywhere than in your office. And I think we forget that sometimes, but there's a whole lot of life out there. If they're back in my office again, and there's not mental illness or behavioral health issues or so forth, there's a reason that they're back again. And I need to kind of run that differential diagnosis of listening one more time. So what about this patient story? We need to hear the story that's behind the story. And that gets to this idea of beyond listening to attending, to find out what's going on in the background. I said this earlier, we have to listen with our eyes and with our heart. And that's where the eye contact comes in. And that's where the mirroring the level of concern with your own facial expression comes in. I made this point also that your ears work better when you're sitting down. In the hospital where I work now, and in the hospitals that I've had the privilege of running in the past, we put stools in all of the patient rooms, and they are providers to sit on while they're there. In the hospital here, they hang on the wall. And the literature clearly shows that when you sit with your patient, and I used to sit on the trash can in my exam rooms, when you sit with your patient, they perceive that you were there longer and you listened better. I think it's partly theater, and leadership and healthcare is very often theater, but I think it's partly true. I think I'm paying more attention when I'm sitting down than if I'm standing up. Now, when I practiced general pediatrics, it was on a paper chart, a paper record. So that was a long time ago, as you well may imagine. As I got into pulmonary, I was using EMRs. And so that thing comes between you and your patients very often, and you have to figure out how to navigate that. If I would tell you talking over it, like I'm sort of doing to the screen now, is not the way to go. Having people next to you and perhaps looking back and forth periodically. It's not really efficient to try and to write that and then go back and do the charts. Your family will get tired of that if you're bringing them home every night. But you'll find your own battle rhythm. I will tell you that probably the EMR will be much faster for you than it ever will be for me, who learned typing in high school as something I might have to do when I typed my papers in college. Your best questions are responsive questions. They're questions that are built on what they ask. Americans are notoriously tellers and not askers. We're tellers and not askers. In fact, that interruption that I'm going to make 17 or 18 minutes into you telling me the story, the chances are pretty good I'm going to tell you something. And I will tell you this. If a patient perceives that you are beginning to tell them what's wrong with them before they feel like they have finished telling you what they think it is, you have already, the train is off the tracks, at least partially off the tracks. We are much better using our skills around active listening. And we say back to them, what I hear you say is, and then have them say back, no, that's not it. And I'll say, well, try again. I may not be listening well. Tell me again. And they'll go back through it again with you. And this time you say, wait. I think what you're telling me is this. And they'll say, yes. By the way, in the practice of healthcare and in healthcare leadership, you are going to be working with patients and families that have unanticipated outcomes. As good as we are, and as good as our systems have become, and colleagues, the healthcare systems today are leaps and bounds, better and safer than they were when I started this journey. As a second-year resident, I was the senior pediatrician in-house in an 850-bed hospital, and I had patients on 10 or 15 different wards, and I was the senior guy. I can't believe that we allowed healthcare. In fact, there was no other attending in the hospital, except perhaps a surgeon in the operating room if they were operating. That's the way things were when I was in medical school and residency in the early to mid 80s. So we've moved very much in the right direction. We're heading in the right direction. This practice of active listening and listening back becomes a key skill when a patient has an unanticipated outcome. There's an accident that happens, or they fall in the room as they're getting out, or someone leaves the crib down in pediatrics and the baby falls out. In those settings, our best skill are these. And we start right from the beginning with apologies, and then active listening. And what we would like to come from that, and you'll have it, is at the end of all that, they say back to you, I really feel like you've listened to me and I appreciate that. They may not, they may still be angry, in which case I will have another meeting with them. And I've done that through my career, and it's changed because when I started, you didn't apologize to anybody. And then let me just comment on this last thing, and that is that a big part of this whole narrative piece under communication, which is the fourth C under our leadership model, character, competence, context, and now communication, narrative and rhetoric. Narrative is the story. One of the inherent skills in medicine is to tell a patient's story succinctly. You'll begin practicing that when you're in medical school in your second year and in your third year, and you'll begin to sift out what is extraneous and what is not extraneous. That patient with asthma, that 10-year-old with asthma that you're seeing, the most important thing in the story is the fact that the child has digital clubbing. Because asthma doesn't give you digital clubbing. I mean, you can have asthma and then have aspiration syndromes that give you bronchiectasis and digital clubbing, or you can have allergic aspergillosis, which also gives you digital clubbing, or can, but it won't, or bronchiectasis and digital clubbing. The point is, though, that finding the key salient parts of that story are key when you're talking to a specialist that you believe is importantly has to see this patient. You're going to tell her or him those pieces of the story that most concern you. A baby admitted on a Friday afternoon for recalcitrant, intractable wheezing, intractable asthma. The infant is 7 or 8 months old, and you're the fellow. I was the pulmonary fellow. I go up to the bedside and I'm listening to this patient, and I do what I always do in every patient. I look at the ears, look at the eyes, look at the nose, feel the femoral pulses. I feel the femoral pulses. I feel it again. And I said, this child has no femoral pulses. This child's got a aortic stenosis, or an interrupted heart, probably not interrupted, but aortic stenosis at least. And this wheezing, it's not asthma, it's heart failure, and the child needs Lasix. Now, the tactical error I made there was I treated before the cardiologist came, and the cardiologist didn't buy it. But in fact, the patient had absent femoral pulses and interrupted aortic arch, or at least aortic stenosis, and aortic arch stenosis. The point is that became a key part of the story when I called the cardiologist, and she or he came to help me manage the patient. The other part of this, I'll tell you, and we'll close with this. I know this has been a long time, but this is a key piece of what you're going to take away from this today, I hope, is when you see a patient and you're convinced that they are in bad shape and what they have could kill them. And then you get the labs back and you realize the platelet count is 25 and the white count is 2. And the patient has got high C-reactive protein and high inflammatory markers. And you know this is overwhelming sepsis. You know this is, in my day, H flu sepsis or group B strep sepsis. And you know that this is a rapid killer. That has to be part of the conversation with the family from the very beginning. And I've told people hundreds of times, listen, I'm going to tell you what I think is wrong, the things I'm worrying about, for 2 reasons. 1, because I want you to know that I'm worrying. And number 2, because at the same time, I hope that I can backpedal on those things and say, listen, it's not sepsis, or it is sepsis, but we're ahead of it, which is key. But that is an important thing. And I would also tell you that when you have that conversation with the patient, please document that you had that conversation. Because what you don't want to have happen is somebody come back to you and say, he never told me. He never told me. And they may not remember. It's not, they're not trying to be malevolent. They may not remember. It's very hard. Those conversations where I walk into the ICU and this patient has got a terminal illness, or has had so much brain damage, I know that they're not going to survive. That's a series of difficult conversations with the family that takes a whole lot. I think the person that's most experienced should do it with you next to them, or the trainee next to them. Because at time you'll be making those conversations as well. So how sick you think they are should come across in the way you communicate them. All right, that's the longest you've ever spent on one slide, but I wanted to spend some time with that. I will tell you that part of what we're after is creating resonance of dissonance. I love this model for the way we relate to our patients, the way we relate to our peers, the way we relate to our superiors. What we're trying to do in these encounters is create resonance. There's a time for dissonance. as a leader, you need to discipline somebody who's not towing the line. We've talked about that in other weeks. And we've also talked about this model. One day I counted how many human interactions I had in a day. It was 283. And the lesson I learned from that was it's not infinite, it's finite. And in the vast majority of them, it wasn't anything I did for somebody. It was words that I exchanged with them, meetings I had with them, passing in the hallway. That 283 times is the number of times I have the opportunity to create resonance in those encounters. And resonance is this flow of influence and the flow of emotions. It says leaders here, but it's clinicians as well. And dissonance is when conflict comes up. In this case, it says employee relationships based on this leadership book, but it's the same thing. You watch this between providers and parents and providers and patients. I tend to defer to parents because I'm a pediatrician, but the goal is for us to establish resonance by sharing whatever it is that the patient is feeling and then earning the trust to reassure them. I'm pretty sure that we're going to be able to help you with this. But here's what I want you to do. I think your child has acute otitis that ear's as angry as I've seen, but he shouldn't get any sicker. And then in fact, in 48 hours, I want to hear from you if the baby still has a fever. And let's talk about what that means. You're on amoxicillin. It's twice a day. And that means you're going to get a dose today and 2 tomorrow, and then 1 on Friday morning. If the baby still has a temperature, say over 101, I want you to bring that baby back in because I want to see him again, and I'll find time in the schedule. They're reassured. The vast majority of the time, they don't need to come back in. You document very specific, concrete follow-up instructions. We establish resonance. They know the plan. I know the plan. It's the same plan I usually use. And it becomes an important part of that clinical encounter. Now, I'll also mention, this is something I learned when I was in Sierra Leone. It's easy to be the guy or the woman that says, I'm not any good with names. I'm sorry, I'm not good with names. I think for people that learn how to memorize the coagulation pathway, it's a tiny bit lame, and I'm talking about myself, because we really could learn names. We just don't pay attention. So trying to discipline ourselves to say, I'm not going to be that person. I'm going to try and learn people's names. And with that, both as a meditation, as a conviction, and as a little bit of a prayer from my own perspective, I have found I'm better at this. I've watched politicians do it. I mean, I got to tour them around our hospitals, so I know it's doable. So I encourage you to mastering names and people's narratives, a little bit about their story, a little bit about their names. So the next time you see them, it'll come spilling back out. And you know what they're going to say? They're going to say, I can't believe you remembered that. And you're going to say to yourself, I can't believe it either. And maybe you'll say out loud, you know, a lot of times I don't remember, but I thought that was such an important story and I really appreciated it. One of the guys in this picture was a member of a group called Clowns Without Borders, and they traveled around the world to refugee camps and so forth. He was an ER nurse that I got to know, and that's a piece of the narrative I don't think I'm ever going to forget. It's a very important piece of the narrative. So mastering names and narratives becomes an important skill, and that begins to play itself out in the way that we communicate. And we've talked about this: reading, writing, the ability to sort of communicate in writing, rounding, listening while we're walking around, and then it leads sort of into this rhetoric, and we'll close with this. That is the idea of what we say. Now, this is couched in our ability to provide inspiration in short snippets, elevator speeches, and so forth. And that's really the purpose in my mind of Morning Huddle. Hopefully, wherever you work, you're going to have morning huddles. And the morning huddle is our ability to communicate the story. We've got to understand it and communicate it. I learned from one of the admirals I once worked for, what's your elevator speech on that? You say we have a problem, or you say that we need to move forward. What's the elevator speech on that? And being able to communicate what's important in a very short conversation becomes key to our ability to keep people focused on what really matters in the story. And I often will point back to a family that I've had the privilege of caring for, the Knowles family. And this is the family. I met them Thanksgiving weekend of 2005. And the father had been injured in a war injury, lost his arm and his leg. They were only recently married. And obviously he recovered, but remarkable story of a family. And when this guy gained consciousness right before Christmas in 2005, the first question he asked was the same question that all of the soldiers asked. who were in charge. What happened to my guys? What happened to my man in the vehicle? And I wasn't there, but someone had to break the news to him that he was the only survivor, and that's something he had to go through. But the privilege of recognizing the stories of the people we have the opportunity to care for becomes part of this whole narrative. And I got to know them very well. His wife had a blog site that she kept with his stories he recovered, and he's still very much engaged, lives here in Maryland, very much engaged with caring for others who might have similar stories. And you can see I got to be the pediatrician for the first daughter, but other pediatricians have stepped in along the way. Man's search for meaning is a primary motivation in his life. At any moment, you must decide for better or worse what the monument of your existence will be. And that ability to speak with rhetoric to what matters becomes key for us as clinical leaders. In fact, Simon Sinek makes this point that energy motivates, but charisma inspires, and charisma characterizes people who get why. The absolute conviction of something, an idea bigger than yourself. That's what we were inspired by when we came into the practice of the care of other people, health care of other people. You'll be surprised how quickly that gets wrung out when you have to work through budgets and you have to work through financing and billing. But don't lose your grip on that thing, because at the end of a long shift, when you still have 6 or 8 more hours to go, this is the thing that keeps you going. And that's the thing that inspires other people to go with you, a clarity of why and a sincerity around that why. Now, we don't have time to do this today, but in the handout that I provided, there's a link to the greatest speech that you've never heard. The night that Martin Luther King was assassinated, Senator Robert Kennedy gave this speech to the people of Indianapolis. And if I had the opportunity to go through this with you, I would ask you to listen to what he said. Remember, he had 0 time to prepare this. He had scribbled notes while he was driving, but the people that were with him said he held it in his hand the whole time. He never looked at them. He quoted poets, and he talked inspirationally about how we needed to heal through this whole thing. One of the more remarkable speeches that I've ever heard, and worth the time for you to listen the 6 minutes and 28 seconds to it, and ask yourself, how could I prepare to be like that on the spur of the moment, to be able to speak to something as important as that? So communicating the story is clarification. What are the key components of this message? Who's the critical messenger? In this case of rhetoric, how will it be communicated, whether it's to a family, whether it's to a group of individuals? You have to say the story over and over again. The motto of the hospital in the middle of the Pacific, where I was a department chair for 7 years, was "We're it for this side of the earth." We're it for this side of the earth. That's part of the message. And so when we get pulled in a lot of different directions and they need us to answer a question in Kadena, Japan, which is on the other side of the international date line and 5 hours apart, 5 hours off the time zone, we will say to ourselves, we're it for this side of the earth. We have to answer these questions. I was just out of that hospital in Hawaii 3 weeks ago, and they gave me a commemorative coin. And on that coin was that same motto that was passed on to me by someone. And I knew that that story was continuing, even though I left that hospital back in 2005. So multiply and over multiply the communication, and then rectify, eliminate misunderstandings and confusion as you go forward. We talked about the healthy climate for communication is one where everybody understands the reason. Nobody says it's not my job, and no one speaks ill of anybody else. And that's the characteristic of a healthy climate. So summarizing, here's what we've been through as a group over these last 4 sessions: character leading self, confidence leading others, context leading work, and then communication. We talked about principles of the clinician leader, and you can develop your own, but we talked about honoring yourself and others, the willingness to admit that you're still learning, consistency across the spectrum, and as well as the ability to believe in something that's bigger than yourself. We talked about the cardinal practices of leader clinicians: reading, writing, rounding, walking around and listening, and then rhetoric, the ability to speak to what matters, that why we talked about. We talked about 4 B's of Leadership Foundation: reading other leaders, reading other clinicians. Who do I want to be like? Why do I want to be like that? What do I not want to do? Whether it's in literature or whether it's the people you come in contact with. And I mentioned the fact that I watched someone write notes and made that part of my own practice. It's still to this day. writing notes to people who do things I appreciate, reading basics around literature, getting meta every day, whatever your philosophy or faith happens to be, and then having a trusted person that you can get up on the balcony with and blow off steam. Somebody sent me a long email today to that effect of a frustrating situation. You've got to have people, and you got to be one of those people that people will come to be able to close the door, be honest and open, and then they can get back into the fight, because it is a difficult business we're in. The 4 Bs is we have no right to ask any clinician to do or be anybody other than we're willing to take on ourselves. Now, having said that, we recognize there are certain things that are challenging. Pediatric intensive care takes a toll on you. And you have to recognize, for example, in that field, and whether it's oncology or whatever you do, that you have to gauge that. We get the privilege of being the one in that moment. And when I talked about eye contact, leaning forward and so forth, that's the opportunity, whether it's even in the hallway when someone stops to ask you a question, you can mirror those behaviors. We talked about Gunther Gable-Williams and being there. And then finally, Gandhi makes the point that when somebody needs to change, we start with ourselves in a setting like that. Leadership experts aren't. So continue your students, your study of what it means to be a clinician leader over time. Leadership is life. And that concept of integrity is making that narrative consistent, whether you're with your kids on the soccer field, whether you're in a bar on a Friday night for happy hour, or whether you're with your very best friend who's going through a difficult time. Make that a consistent story. Nature, nurture, and Knox in terms of where this clinician leadership comes from. The secret of success in life is for man to be ready for his time, for a person to be ready for their time when it comes. A person be ready for their time when it comes. And bad leadership, we've talked about this, it's common. Intentionally bad leadership, intentionally bad clinical care is rare. Most of what turns out to be good is intentional and attentional, and very often not thinking through where we are, what we're doing in that setting is part of that problem. Our job is to replace ourselves, is to raise up the next generation of clinician leaders over the course of your life so that you can pass the torch onto somebody that's going to do better than we did. And the best way we do that is from example and through example, as Michael Yassine pointed out. Tempus, Duce Tempus exit means the times require leaders. And I hope that when this is all over, you see yourselves that way. I'm going to stop there and unshare my screen and see if anybody has any questions or comments.
Thank you for your mentorship and teaching, Dr. Callahan. We'll begin our Q&A session now. Joe, just before we begin, you don't have to leave right now, right?
I am good for at least 15 minutes, so you're good.
All right, sounds good. Now, you mentioned a lot about implicit biases during your session, and I understand that everybody has implicit biases to some extent or another. So how do you feel we could potentially improve our personal implicit biases, and how did you work to overcome them in your career personally?
It's a great question, and it's a sensitive one because I didn't realize how much I had, to be honest with you. I have found the implicit bias test from Harvard to be very helpful because it was the first one that helped me to recognize that I might be carrying bias towards people of color. And I'm being completely transparent with you now, in honesty. And it's been something of a journey. Where they came from exactly, I don't think I really thought about it until I got the results back of that test. And part of it also is we now live in a neighborhood where my particular demographic is a minority, and so having to come to terms with those things. So I think, and it's not part of this talk, but it is part of a talk I'm going to give next, that the best way to overcome bias is to have regular interactions with the individuals from the group that you have historically been taught to fear. And I think Martin Luther King was the one who said that originally. And so we have those opportunities all around us, people that are different than us that we can get to know, and through those interactions realize that we have that we are carrying around biases that are unjustified, as they often are. They usually are.
I think that answer ties in perfectly throughout the entirety of your session where you're talking about communication and really touching people. That's the best way to really learn from one another. Otherwise, we'll always be trapped in our own bubbles and we'll never be able to expand from them. Now, something else that you talked about as well was talking about joking whenever something happens. You know, a joke, a laugh is the difference between crying. Now, I've also seen a little bit of the medical field. I haven't truly been at the forefront. I've never been in the trauma room. I've only been in the OR once in my life. So I personally haven't been there, but I've been behind the scenes. I've seen some conferences after the cath lab, and I see jokes going around about what happened there. So whenever we do see deaths in the field or tragedies happening before us in the medical field, how do we prevent ourselves from getting desensitized to the suffering of our patients and their families?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. We don't want to ever become desensitized, and there's a fine line between, weeping with those who weep, being able to identify with your patients, and also trying to keep some element of distance. And I'm not going to tell you that I've been 100% successful at that. I will say this, that we talked about joking. Joking that is at the expense of other people is not is really not acceptable, particularly when it has to do with sexual harassment, which I've just watched too much over the course of my career and the course of my life. I think we're starting to become more aware of it. But the kind of joking that I'm sort of talking about is being in a code situation. The code's going okay, and it's 2:30 in the morning. Everybody just rolled out of bed, and I'm barking out commands, and I'm going atropine, bicarb. Let's give it a little bit more bicarb. Is the fluid running? And then there's a pause for a minute, and somebody in the group says, mouthwash. So meaning that my barking out commands probably was a little bit more noxious than I realized, because we had just all rolled out of bed. And that wasn't at anybody's expense, but we all laughed about that afterwards. So I think having a sensitivity, we don't want anyone hurt by what it is that we have to say as well.
Thank you very much. Now, this is coming from the opposite side. This is coming directly from the patients rather than from the physicians. So with the advent of the internet, sometimes patients may come in with their own personal ideas of the diagnosis. So we always heard the stories, people going on Google, Mayo Clinic, WebMD, whatever website it is, and they have their own idea for what diagnosis they have for their situation. How do you recommend we can approach communicating with our patients if they are mistaken in this way?
Well, I mean, the first step is honestly to approach that situation as though they could be right. What happens a lot of times in pediatrics, even before the parents would go on the internet, is the parents would come in with an idea of what they think it is, because somebody in school said that about the child or something else. And they said, I think this is X. We can either tell at that point or we can ask at that point. And I would encourage you to ask. So they come in with a sheet of papers. I'm convinced that this is, blank. I think that my child has severe gastroesophageal reflux. Why do you think that? I mean, tell me a little bit about how you arrived at that conclusion. I will tell you that people who feel heard are much likely to hear you afterwards. And does it slow this process down? Yes. Does it mean that I have to use more than one appointment? Sometimes. And so sometimes if it looks to me like it's going to be really tough, and as a specialist, often that's exactly the case. They have, as the good book said, suffered at the hand of many physicians. So they've been out there. Now they're coming to see you. I'll tell them up front, you've had this going on for weeks. This is going to take me a couple of times. So why don't you come back tomorrow at 3:30? I can see I don't have any patients on there. Does that work from your schedule? And they'll say, sure. Then come back in and let me take a look at this again. We're going to go back through this. I tell you, I mean, unless somebody's life or death, the nice thing about most ambulatory practices is you have time. And that's the most precious gift that you can give the patient and their family, time. And eventually they will trust you enough because they are heard for you to say that I agree with this piece. I'm a little bit concerned about it, and let me tell you why.
That again goes back to everything we talked about communication. I never thought of it that way. Whenever I've heard about the story, especially during COVID, with people coming up with their own perspectives regarding medical practice, I never thought that the best approach would be to actually sit down and ask them why they thought that, because I always thought that it was just some very stubborn point of view that they wouldn't change. So in your experience, people have changed their minds after you've let them speak first.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, often they'll start, remember I was in military medicine for a long time, and people like to lump things together. They'll say things like, well, I'm never coming back to University of Maryland again, or I'm never coming back to blank again, and they lump things together, and that's the first thing they say to me. And so you'd like to basically just say, well, then, okay, I guess we're done. But then you ask the question, well, why is that? And then you find out that they have had people not listen to them, and they were concerned about things. And so as you spend the time, I always approach those things as, as me saying, I want these people to regain trust in me and then generalize that to the healthcare system in general. Why? Because in the end, they're likely to be more healthy if they could learn to trust the healthcare system, because we do have some things to contribute to their health and well-being. Increasingly so, as you move from the way I was trained into the way you guys were trained, where we're spending much more time talking about health and well-being than just the absence of disease. And so I think that those are all, important points. But I think it sometimes takes more than one 10-minute appointment or one 15-minute appointment. And the patients they'll come, not always, but they'll come back, especially if they trust you.
Thank you. Now, our final situation again. This final question is again about the patient side of things. Historically, there's in the context of historical medicine, there's some mistrust between physicians and patients of color.
Yes.
How do you think this can be alleviated for future doctors of my generation?
First off, I was stunned during COVID how many people in Baltimore, because we ran the mass testing sites. I think we ended up doing almost 180,000 tests. So that's a lot of people interacting with them. And I was on the floors most of the day. Amazing to me how many people brought up Tuskegee, and amazing to me how many people brought up Henrietta Lacks, for those of you who don't know the story of Henrietta Lacks at Hopkins. And these are people from the city. This isn't like just college professors coming in. So the point is that people are carrying a lot of this with them. And the first step is recognizing that it's there. Recognizing that while I know that I'm probably the brightest person you're ever going to encounter today, they don't come into the encounter believing that to be true. And I'm just kidding about what I said before. Having the humility to recognize that they are carrying this with them. And the best thing that I can do is allow them to feel comfortable sharing their own concerns without becoming defensive. And remember, the key, listen to yourself. If you are telling and not asking, you've got to ask yourself why. Larry King said that nothing I say today will teach me anything. He was an interviewer. And so if you find yourself into the telling mode already instead of asking, especially in a difficult situation, back up a little bit and ask again. So I think recognizing that is there, and you don't automatically deserve to be trusted or listened to just because you have a bow tie on or just because you've got an ID badge. That kind of humility, I think, goes a long way. And patients know way more about what's going on than we give them credit for, particularly the mothers of patients. And oh, by the way, your nurses do too. And if you don't listen to the nurses in the NICU or in the ICU and so forth, you're doing it at your own risk. They're there with them all day long. And if they're a little worried about something and you're not worried about it, you're crazy. So I think being able to communicate that with patients, recognizing that it's there and earning that level of trust by active listening and respect, treating people with respect, that's where that honor word comes in. People know that I trust and value them. I call them with their title. Bad thing in pediatrics is we call everybody mom and dad. It's because we're too lazy to look up their names. They earned the title. If it's a rank, if it's Mr. or Mrs., Ms., whatever, they earned that. Get in the habit of using it. If somebody says, "Oh, just call me Barbara," I'm always a little hesitant with that. You're not going to call me Chuck, probably. So anyway, that level of visible respect for you and your title, I think, is also an important thing that we can do, and it doesn't cost you anything.
I think overall, the theme that we have encountered here is that patients should almost feel like they're part of the team that's trying to figure out what's wrong.
Well said. Well said. That's the future of healthcare. Well said. Because you're trusting them to go home and do what you ask them to do, to take that asthma medicine or finish the antibiotics. And if they're not part of the team and part of the decision process, they are less likely to do it. And I think there's literature to that. So that's really well said, Mom.
Thank you very much, Dr. Callahan. Those are all the questions we had for today. The students learned so much from your 4-part Ducimus series, and a playlist and course for healthcare leadership derived from your sessions will be released shortly. We would like for everyone to give a warm thank you to Dr. Callahan in this chat box for his inspirational session. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate the privilege of being able to be able to talk to you today. Thanks for having me today and for the other times as well. Best to you all. Stay in touch. If you walk past me in the hospital or where you are, please stop me and say hi. Take care.
All right, now we'll be hosting our closing session with our future session dates. So the link to the quiz for the session is now live. You'll need a 70% or higher to pass and receive certification. And that link is being sent in the chat now. Now on to our next session dates. The dates will be posted throughout our social media outlets, so please be sure to follow us at TeleShadowing. And our next live session will be on next Saturday, July 8th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Because July 1st is going to be the July 4th holiday weekend. So we'll be having it next week. It'll be pediatrics. And yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's session. We hope to see you in upcoming sessions as well. And this concludes this week's shadowing. Thank you.